Episode 56. Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast. Patty Krawec on deck. Author, writer, mom, wife. She's going to bridge the gap for us when it comes to finding your identity, finding your people. Her story is amazing. There are going to be pieces of Indigenous teaching and spirituality here. Patty's going to share her story, her upbringing. We're both up here in Canada. I'm on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta. Welcome, friends. Wherever you found this podcast, please review it. Tell all your friends. This is a two-part episode. I split it into two episodes. You're going to enjoy both. The second half will talk about Patty's book, Becoming Kin. But in this episode, we're going to jump right in and learn where Patty is, who are her people, and then roll from there.
Yeah, so I'm in Niagara, so between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, it's one dish territory. So it's that one dish is a treaty that was made between the Anishinaabe and the Anishinaabe people and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And, you don't make treaty with people that you get along with, right? You make treaty to resolve conflict. So we're deep in on mixed Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory. There's a lot of argument over, whose language the city of Toronto was named for, and and who did this and who did that. But at the end of the day, we do try to work together and work cooperatively. So that's kind of where I'm living. I'm on the board of the Fort Erie Friendship Center. We actually have two friendship centers in this area because there are so many Native people down here. And I had no idea. I grew up here. My people on my father's side are Ojibwae Anishinaabe from the north shore of Lake Superior, and actually a little further north than that, from all the little lakes that dot northwestern Ontario. So that's my father's people. And then my mom's people are refugees who came from, first they fled the Ukraine, then they fled Germany, and they came here. So I was actually raised down here by my maternal family, and I had no idea. I thought all the Indians were out west somewhere, like living in teepees or something. I had no idea. I grew up, I grew up in late 60s and 70s. There are two reserves within like an hour and a half. I had no idea. There was a friendship center in the town I grew up in. I had no idea. My mom had been told that it was very dangerous, that there were a lot of drugs there, which was not true, but a very racist way of thinking about Indigenous people. And so she thought she was protecting me by keeping me away from a place that she had been told was dangerous, which is very typical of how Canadians. I mean, this was kind of the tail end of the residential school era as well, right? So very typical way of thinking, because that's what we're told, right? That's, and so that's what I grew up thinking about Native people, that we were simultaneously, these kind of mystical, forest dwelling nature nuts. So on the one hand, there's this like ridiculously noble myth, but also you shouldn't drink because you're genetically predisposed to alcoholism, which is also not true. So it was simultaneously this thing I could never possibly live up to, but also this thing that I needed to be careful about. So it was really odd. And I actually found my father's people in my mid-20s. And then that kind of started the process of, so what does it mean to, Becoming Kin was, a book that I kind of wrote for myself too. How do I become a good relative to my relatives? How do I build relationship with them? How do I, because they knew I existed. So they had wondered what had happened to me. I wondered what happened to them. So how do we put this together? How do we like, and they were raised kind of surrounded by each other in northwestern Ontario and in Winnipeg, which, is kind of frequently referred to as the urban res. Whereas I was raised with everybody knowing I was Native, people having these expectations of me that I had no idea how to deliver.
Hmm.
I had no idea how to be Native, be Indian. I had no idea. And yet people expected it of me at school or in other places.
Hmm.
Um,
They expected
yeah,
the impression of, their impression of what
yeah,
being Native was.
exactly. They wanted me to
Uh,
kind of perform Indianness for them. And I knew as much about Indians as they did, like from
yeah.
watching Little House on the Prairie and
Oh,
Bonanza.
no. Oh, jeez.
So,
No.
yeah, so that's, kind of where I'm situated in One Dish territory. The Ojibwe, so the Anishinaabe are like a really big group, like we're huge. And so my father is Ojibwae Anishinaabe, and that would be Northwestern Ontario. This area down here is Mississauga Anishinaabe, the people, the river people. Similar, like the language and the basic cosmology are the same,
Hmm.
but there are some dialectical differences. So we're not interchangeable. So I'm actually not even though I'm Anishinaabe, I'm not really on my home territory.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still, a guest, and so I think about that. I think about that. How do I be a good relative to the Mississauga
Yeah.
Anishinaabe people on whose land this is?
Yeah.
How do I be a good relative to the Haudenosaunee people whose land this is? Because although I'm Anishinaabe, this isn't really my territory. My territory is much further north and west. That's the land that remembers me. So how do I be a good relative down here? And I'm on the board of a friendship center, so I have some authority. So how do I help the friendship center make decisions recognizing whose land we're on? It's yeah. So these are all things that I think about, and it occurred to me recently that I kind of wrote my book for myself as well to kind of figure out how do I be a good relative in all of these different ways that I exist.
You're using the term good relative, and I can imagine that growing up and then becoming more in tune with your people on your father's side in your 20s would have thrust you into a space of chaos or struggle as you're trying to make sense of who you are in your identity. Did you start with the idea of what it means to be a good relative? Because I think that's a very specific term you're using. Or was there a process there as you were learning more about your people that you knew nothing about, where you started to get, where you started to shape and form around your other familial connections?
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, being good relative, that's fairly new language that's, kind of getting a lot of currency and, people thinking about it that way. It was more about who are my cousins?
Hmm.
Who are my
Mm-hmm.
cousins? I want to meet my grandma. I don't remember her. My Nokomis. I have pictures of myself with her, but I haven't seen her since I was a year and a half old.
Hmm.
What about these cousins that are in these photographs? What about my dad? My father, like how do I, because we're strangers,
Yeah.
right? We don't have all of those shared, we don't have all those shared memories to help you get through these struggles,
Hmm.
right? So I wrote a piece for Canadian Living that was actually my very first piece of writing, because my father had taken me to a powwow and I'd never been to a powwow before. And so he took me to a powwow at Nipissing First Nation outside of North Bay. And so I wrote about that. And I wrote about how that felt and kind of hanging out. He had brought me there for a sunrise ceremony and then went back home, because sunrise happens early in the summer. And so then he went back home to sleep. And I said, well, I'll just stay and hang out and just kind of meet people and talk to people. And I did. I just kind of hung out and drank coffee with people and watched them get their stuff ready because people camp, right? People camp at these things. And so that's what I did. And so I was thinking in terms of what are my expectations of what it means to be Native,
Hmm.
not those outside
Yeah.
expectations that other people have. And what are other Native people's expectations of me?
Hmm.
what assumptions are they making about me, or things are they expecting from me? And I always found myself very welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever Native community I've been to, I've always felt welcome, which I know isn't everyone's experience. I mean, I have friends who have gone home after being scooped by child welfare. They go home decades later and they don't experience that welcome
Mm-hmm.
because they're too different. So I know that that's not a universal feeling, but that was my experience. People were just very gracious, and I started hanging out at the Friendship Center in Toronto. Um, but then when we moved back down to Niagara Falls, because we were living up in Brampton at the time, I didn't know there was a Friendship Center down here. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
because I grew up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know that there was one. It wasn't actually until I started working for child welfare
Mm-hmm.
that I found the Native community in the Niagara region. And isn't that
Hmm.
a terrible thing?
That's and
That I had to start working for child welfare, and that's where I met all the Native people.
I want to stick with. We're just kind of like digging into identity here in your story. What was it? I want to say not what was it like, but how did you balance the tension of your formation growing up on your mom's side and what we would just say a normal Canadian life up until your 20s, and to hold that intention now with the other half of you. Not to now be careful how I say this, because when we start to use when we fraction off our identities, I think that's a product of white supremacy. But the other whole part of you, when they collided, what was that tension like, and how did you begin to make sense of it?
Well, I think like there was a lot of emotional chaos,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I'm reconnecting with a father who had been absent, and he had his own reasons, and my mom had her own reasons. And the piece that I wrote for Canadian Living annoyed both of them. So they both felt that, I mean, they were proud of it, but also they felt that I had gotten their side of it wrong, their
Uh-huh.
reasons wrong. Because,
Oh,
so I feel like I must have come somewhat close to the truth.
yeah, yeah,
Annoyed
yeah.
both of
You told your story, so yeah.
That's right. But I had always known, like, I was the brown kid in the white family.
Yeah.
So for me, finding my paternal
Mm-hmm.
relatives was a relief,
You always knew.
because I always knew. And like I said,
Yeah,
people would have these expectations of me.
yeah, yeah.
Do you
Mm.
speak Indian? What's it like? Can you
Yeah,
talk to the animals?
yeah,
That kind of nonsense. And then they would ask me, what part Indian are you? What part? What part?
yeah,
Like that
yeah,
was,
yeah,
what part? And so I would, because I was a kid and kids are idiots, I would say things like, my heart and my brain. you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I always felt, because it was something that other people always told me I was. So I always felt native, felt
Mm-hmm.
different.
You were othered.
Very well loved by my family. I'm clear
Mm.
about that in the book, that it wasn't that they didn't love me. I was just different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so finding my place in the Native community after finding my dad was a relief, because now here is a room full of people like me. Here is a room full of people who look like me. Here is a room full of people
Yeah.
with whom I share disconnection,
Mm. Oof.
because my story isn't that unusual, right? I
Yeah.
mean, child
Mm.
welfare, it's called the 60s scoop for a reason,
Yeah.
because so many of us were uprooted from our families and raised in white families, and came back in Canada, came back to friendship centers. And in the US, I think they have a lot of urban Indian centers that are similar. So even that disconnection was something that we shared.
Mm.
And so for me, it was a relief to be in those spaces. To be in the women's circle, and to be talking about those
Yeah.
things. That part wasn't the chaos. That part was the relief. But it's like the emotional chaos of just reconnecting with a
Yeah.
parent
Yeah.
that, you have been
Mm-hmm.
told one thing about, and some of it's true and some of it's not. But watching my kids have a better relationship with him
Mm.
was really good. Watching my kids grow up more aware of not just the fact of their internal identity, but their community
Yeah.
connections
Yeah.
has been really good.
That's
And
a,
knowing that
yeah.
my grandson is being raised with, like 2 generations away from that traumatic
Yeah.
disconnection.
Yeah.
Like to me, that's just amazing.
It's reclamation. Like that's reclamation unto restoration. That's a beautiful
Yeah,
tale.
yeah, it is. It is a beautiful story.
It's wild that no matter how hard, it's wild as in, I shouldn't say it's wild because it's not. It's to be expected that no matter how hard you might try to assimilate within the life that you knew for the first quarter of it was never going to work. And you were never going to find that relief, as you said, of being the brown kid in the all white communities. Yet you found that, and your story, as you alluded to earlier, will be different than others, but you found that relief of belonging when you were with your dad's side, with your other people. Do you
Yeah.
like that? Do you say the other people? How do you, I find that a work I need to work out of, in terms of no longer othering or fractioning or compartmentalizing my people.
Well, because we live in all kinds of different ways, right? Like I was raised evangelical Christian, right?
Mm.
Like James Dobson, I subscribed to his magazine, as a young mother.
Yeah.
Chuck Colson. I don't know if you watch
Dang.
Thief in the Night. Periodically, I watch Thief in the Night just to
You were
be
in the
amazed by
thick
it.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, just yeah. Oh yeah, I was like right in the belly of the beast. Um, and so that's the piece that I'm still unpicking out of my brain. Still
Mm-hmm.
kind of unpicking, kind of that early training out of my brain. And that's also something that's very common in Native communities because the missionaries came in and did a real number on us. And so you'll find a lot of very conservative,
Yeah.
very evangelical, Pentecostal communities
Mm-hmm.
that are very unhealthy.
Any folks who have been pressed to the margins by this colonizing force when they adopt this story of that power, that malformed power, I like that. Yeah, I have a hurt for those folks because, and for any folks, not just for Indigenous folks, but for those who have yet to discover their liberation. Maybe I just don't have a word for it, but to see the community in operation within the boundaries of malformed power systems, marginalized communities doing that, that's hard for me to watch. I usually take the easy way out and just ignore, dissociate myself from all these things and go do my own thing. But that's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, well, when you think about how devastated our communities were, right? Like politically devastated, with the legacies of slavery and forced move, all the different ways that we were forced to move. Um, epidemics, the viruses that raged through the communities and and devastated us, all of those different
Mm.
things. And so our communities get thrown into this chaos. And then the missionaries come in because, we've lost elders, we've lost relationship, we've
Mm.
lost all of those things. And then the missionaries come in and they give us answers. This is why things are so unstable, and they offer a promise of stability. And so, of course, drowning people are going to grab it because they no longer have whatever traditional teachings they had that could have grounded them
Mm.
are no longer available to them. And so that's early in my book. I talk about the importance of picking up our bundles. All of us have bundles to
Yes.
pick up,
Yes.
not just like,
Yeah.
I know that's very Indigenous language.
Yeah. I love that.
Um, but all of us have bundles we need to pick up and teachings that we need to ground ourselves in. And, and for me, that is a really big piece of the work that I need to do, the work that other people need to do. And that's, kind of the early tasks in the book. I really want people to look at what do you need to pick up and connect with from your own histories, from your own past, from your own, what has been taken from you that you can pick back up again to help us move forward in a way that isn't these malformed power structures.
I loved that metaphor. That was a powerful chapter in the book that you carried. And it actually spurred an idea, maybe a book, I don't know. My response to that, what your bundle is to find your people. Find your people, learn from your people, learn from your ancestors. I think that's a powerful step in determining or discovering who you are, but also how you shape and form going forward, especially if it's outside of a white hegemonic gaze. But so here's the curveball when we bring it closer to our current context on land, is the fact many people, including white folks, maybe especially white folks, no longer have a connection to their people. They couldn't tell you. It could be through nefarious efforts, either genocide or slavery, being extricated from your lands, or domestic servitude, as it is in my case. Or you could be the European settlers, colonizers who came through, and part of the deal was you gave up who your people are, or the memory of, in exchange for the modicum of power reserved in whiteness. Just take on the whiteness, but then you lose your people. So now what? Where do you, and I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here as we sort of think out loud on bundles, but where do you go from there? What if you don't have your people?
Well, I think to some extent, your people are the ones that are around you. I mean, there's a task in the book where I ask people to create a family tree, because every chapter ends with a task. That was Valerie's idea. She says, white people like to be told what to do. They want to know what to do with this. So like, okay. But I liked it because it was a way of making the text, operationalizing it, if I'm going to use social work language, a way of making it something that you can do in your life. And so I asked people to create a family tree, and then to look at history alongside that family tree. What was happening for your family? What was happening for Indigenous people at that time? What was happening for Black people at that time? Who were the migrants that were coming in, and grandparents, great-grandparents? And people can usually do that. They can create a family tree. Alexis Shotwell calls it roots and roots. So the roots of our family, as well as the roots that they took. How did they get here to Canada? Like when we ask white people where they're from, they'll say, oh, I'm from Hamilton. Okay, but before that.
Yeah. And if you even knew, from? Like, oh, maybe
where
Ireland.
Are you from? Yeah, Ireland. Okay. Think about how your people got here, because you're here. So you're not Irish, because Ireland continued on without you. Spain continued on without you. Germany carried on without you. So your family came here. So how do you root yourself here in a good way? How do you build relationship in this place? And there's so I'm rereading this book by Monica Byrne called The Actual Star. It's a fiction. It's set in the past, present, and future. So Mayan civilization, present time, also in Belize, and then a future that ends in Belize. And so these three stories kind of converge. But there's a practice that the woman in the final, like in the future, where what she does is she walks around the land and asks it if it knows her. Do you know me? Do you know me? Because she's looking for evidence of past lives. Do you know me? Do you know me? I just thought, because I had that experience when I went home, and I write about this in the book, where I wasn't expecting it, because I'm like the least mystical Indian you'll ever know. So it's not like I went home looking for some kind of mystical experience. I wasn't expecting that. But I talk about this in the book, that I put my hands in the water and I felt remembered. And it's really hard to describe. In the book, I say it kind of felt electric, but that's not even really correct. That was just kind of the best I could do. I felt remembered. And it was unsettling, but also amazing. And I think if the land is alive, because that's also like in the indigenous cosmology, not just indigenous, I think you could argue that the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrews understood the world that way as well. A lot of land-based, people who haven't yet been disconnected from their land understand that the land and the animals and the plants, that all these things are alive in very particular ways. So if it is, then we can be in that kind of relationship with it. So if people are looking to find their people are the people that are around them. We all have family histories and family traditions. So we can think about those things, but then we can also ask the land to know us and to remember us. Like if your family has been here for 3 or 4 generations, then the land knows you. And maybe it heard stories about you. We think of the ocean as this big barrier, but if the land and the water are alive, then is it really a barrier? Aren't they talking to each other and sharing stories about you and your island people? Doesn't the water tell the land that it laps up on stories about your Caribbean people? And then those stories kind of get carried north to where you are. And so then the land knows something about you, because we know now that trees communicate through those mycelium networks that, my kid goes on, he's a tree nerd, and then he goes on and on about. So we know that that's a thing, that trees, maybe they're talking about us. Who knows? I don't know. I don't need to know everything. I'm okay with not knowing everything. But I think that that's a really kind of a neat practice, an interesting way of thinking. So maybe as people are walking around outside, they could think about that. Like, what do you know about me? What have you heard about me?
Yeah, that's a posture to approach land through the lens of relationship and reciprocal relationship. Do you find that there needs to be invitation to do so, to ascend or descend into that type of reorientation to the land? I ask that question because I think it would be easy for us, especially for Westerners, to be like, well, I will just invite myself to know the land, and through a Western imperialist lens, Well,
and that's where I thought that this practice that Monica Byrne writes about, and I mean, and it's fiction. I don't know that it's a practice that anybody actually really does, but she imagined it. And the character is just asking the land if it knew her. Do you know me? And I think that's a respectful way to do it. Do you know me? You know me? Because often she gets no, or she just gets blankness. She gets nothing. But it's that willingness to hear no. And that's like in Canada, we have, the duty to consult Indigenous communities, but we don't have the right to say no. So if the government wants to, dig up diamonds or build a pipeline or chop down the trees or whatever it wants to do, it will talk to the community and get input, but the community doesn't have the right to say no.
Yes.
So what kind of consultation is that? That's ridiculous.
The posture.
If you're going to ask people, if you're going to ask the land if it remembers you, if you're going to knock on somebody's door, you have to be willing to hear no, or not right now, or you have to be willing to hear that. Like you wouldn't go into somebody's backyard and just set up a barbecue.
Yeah. So the posture does matter. Oh, I love that. I'm so glad we went down that trail. Thanks for listening to part 1 of this 2-part episode. part 2 up next, where we will spend more time discussing Patty's book, Becoming Kin. Please rate and review this podcast, share it with others, and we'll catch you in episode 57.